Hello, I'm William Sanchez, and this is the Philosophical Rebellion Substack. Right now, there are at least 3 genocides unfolding around the world. And in all instances, in every case of genocide, the people committing it are at fault, not the people being genocided. That is even true when it comes to the Israeli government, who are engaged in the indiscriminate bombing, collective punishment, and using starvation as a weapon of war against Gazans, all amounting to a plausible genocide, which the International Court of Justice is now pursuing a full trial in order to prosecute. Even though it has been clear for multiple months that the Israeli government is engaged in war crimes with the intent to ethnically cleanse Gaza, the United States has continued unconditional support for the Israeli government throughout all of that. And one of the biggest reasons is that there is no topic more heavily censored or subjected to intense disinformation than criticism of the state of Israel. Inside of the United States, there is an extreme pro-Israel bias in the mainstream media, and that has resulted in many Americans unintentionally supporting a genocide which their media is telling them doesn't even exist. So it is important to challenge your own media intake and to make sure you are getting all the facts, because we know that the media is not telling the whole story. If you only listen to the mainstream media in America, you are a victim of propaganda. But that does not mean it is okay just because your media is telling you it is. If today you are still supporting Israel, it is your personal responsibility to challenge your own media intake to make sure you are getting the full story. So what is the full story, and how does that differ from what the mainstream media in America is telling everybody? And that boils down to 3 main topics: the context leading up to October 7th, the intent behind the Israeli government's response to October 7th, and the actual facts of how Israel has conducted its military operation in Gaza. And in all 3 of those instances, the American mainstream media has frequently spread disinformation to glorify the Israeli government and vilify all Palestinians. But the actual facts of the situation are much different than what's being represented. So, starting with the first issue, one of the main talking points is that Israel had completely turned over all of Gaza to the Palestinians in 2005. They even say that they handed over the keys to Gaza and had completely withdrawn from the territory. But that is not true in any sense. The actual situation on the ground, according to the United Nations, was that the Israeli military in 2007 enacted an air, land, and sea blockade of Gaza. That blockade was illegal and led to mass poverty throughout the entire Gazan territory. So that blockade started in 2007. Then in 2019, Human Rights Watch investigated the Israel-Hamas conflict and found that the Israeli government was committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. That claim was then investigated by Amnesty International, who in 2021 found that the Israeli government was in fact committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. Even an Israeli human rights organization called B'Tselem said Israel is not a democracy, it is an apartheid state. So then the United Nations investigated whether or not the Israeli government was committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. And what the United Nations appointed investigator concluded was that the recommendations were overwhelmingly directed towards Israel, and that was taken as an indicator of the asymmetrical nature of the conflict, which they called the reality of one state occupying the other. So, before the war, it was the consensus of the world's leading human rights organizations and the United Nations that the Israeli government was committing the crime against humanity of apartheid. So, instead of the false narrative that the Israeli government had handed over the keys to Gaza, the reality was that they were occupying Gaza with an apartheid blockade. And many people ask why the Palestinians only fought back violently, but they were silent the whole time before that. And again, that's not true. The Palestinian people launched a peaceful boycott, divestment, sanction movement against Israeli apartheid. That was a peaceful, non-violent political and economic protest against apartheid. But within America, many politicians like Ron DeSantis advocated for strict anti-BDS laws, which would make it illegal for American citizens or American businesses to support the BDS movement. And over 30 US states now have anti-BDS laws. In addition to the boycott, divestment, sanction movement, there was also the 2018 Great March of Return, where Palestinians would walk over to the fence separating Gaza from Israel just to look out at the land that they were kicked off of. And in the non-violent Great March of Return, the Israeli government set up tanks and snipers, where the Israeli military would shoot at unarmed civilians walking near the wall. And in the Great March of Return, the Israeli government was documented shooting children and medical staff, with over 100 Palestinians falling victim to Israel's attacks, and over 30,000 sustaining injuries. So the Israeli government cracked down violently on any form of peaceful protest the Palestinians engaged in to oppose the Israeli apartheid occupation of Gaza. Then the Israel lobby within the United States worked very hard to restrict the right of Americans to oppose Israeli apartheid. Even in September 23, just weeks before the war, multiple Palestinians had died from the Israeli military, and the Israeli military had engaged in a multi-day bombing campaign. So there was absolutely no ceasefire on October 7th. That is a false narrative. That is a deceptive talking point spread by people attempting to justify an ongoing genocide. So, the context before the war was that the Israeli government was engaged in the crime against humanity of apartheid, had violently cracked down on all forms of peaceful protest, had made themselves a fierce opponent of American free speech, and according to the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, was not a democracy. So, just to be clear, the Israeli government in no way represents Western democratic values. The Israeli government is an apartheid state. And one of the main forms of apartheid that the Israeli government engaged in was the fragmentation of the Palestinian population. And as a result of the fragmentation, different populations of Palestinians had different leadership, which Netanyahu knew and used as a tool to keep the Palestinians separated so that they could not unify and actually push for a single Palestinian state. So Netanyahu actually propped up Hamas as the more violent alternative to other Palestinian factions, which he saw as a means to prevent the establishment of a Palestinian state. On top of that, it was reported that the Israeli government had detailed Hamas battle plans more than 1 year before the attack. Then, weeks before the October 7th attack, the Egyptian government warned the Israeli government that something big was coming and it was being planned from Gaza. Then, Israeli intelligence within the Gaza Strip warned the Israeli government of an impending attack the day before it happened. Unfortunately, the Israeli government failed to prepare for the attack, even with detailed Hamas battle plans, warnings from their foreign neighbors, and warnings from their own intelligence agency. Instead, the Israeli government actually moved troops away from the southern border to the occupied West Bank to protect illegal settlement construction. And once the Hamas terrorist attack actually started on October 7th, the Israeli military took hours to respond, and when they finally did respond, there were reports of friendly fire. So it is very important to ask how one of the most advanced militaries in the world, with every warning they could have possibly hoped for, failed to protect their own citizens. How was there such an incredible intelligence failure? So the intelligence failure that facilitated the Hamas terrorist attack is one of the most important aspects that needs investigation, because there is no reasonable way that a ragtag team of terrorists truly got the better of one of the most advanced and well-funded militaries in the entire world, when that military had detailed enemy battle plans and every warning any other government could ever hope for. But Benjamin Netanyahu, just a few months earlier, had given a speech at the United Nations where he depicted a map called the New Middle East, which had Israel control of the territory from the river to the sea, with absolutely no mention of Palestinians. And it had also leaked out that Benjamin Netanyahu had tasked one of his top advisors with creating a plan to thin the Gaza population to a minimum. And another plan had leaked out from the Israeli government saying that they intended to force the population of northern Gaza to the south, then force the population of southern Gaza to Rafah, then create such a horrific humanitarian crisis in Rafah that the United States and other international actors would help to build a refugee settlement in the Egyptian desert, where the Israeli government had planned to relocate the population of Gaza, meaning that the Israeli government, all the way up to Benjamin Netanyahu, had a clear goal to ethnically cleanse Gaza of all Palestinians. So that brings us to where we are today, where the Israeli government bombed northern Gaza to the point of being uninhabitable and ordered a mass civilian evacuation from the north to the south. Then the Israeli government engaged in an indiscriminate bombing campaign in the south of Gaza, ordering all of those Palestinians to Rafah. And in the indiscriminate bombing of Gaza, the Israeli government has killed over 30,000 civilians. The vast majority are women and children. By indiscriminate, I mean that the Israeli government has bombed residential buildings, schools, UN facilities, refugee camps, evacuation zones, designated safe zones, and the vast majority of basic infrastructure inside of Gaza. In addition to those indiscriminate bombing campaigns, the Israeli government has also gone on targeted bombing campaigns. Unfortunately, they have been targeting Palestinian civilians fleeing for their lives. Also, in addition to the indiscriminate bombing campaign, the Israeli government announced early in the war plans to cut off food, water, electricity, and medicine to the entire civilian population of Gaza, over 2.3 million civilians, even though Hamas was estimated to have less than 100,000 members. So, although a targeted military campaign against Hamas would have been justified after October 7th, the Israeli government did not in any way engage in a targeted military campaign. Instead, the Israeli government clearly announced plans to engage in the war crime of collective punishment. So now, since October 7th, the Palestinian population of Gaza has lived under the indiscriminate bombing campaign and siege of Gaza conducted by the Israeli military. And that siege has now led to the point where 1.1 million Gazans are on the brink of famine. Children have already starved to death, literally died from starvation as a result of the Israeli military's collective punishment of Gaza. So the Israeli government is using starvation as a weapon of war against over 1 million civilians. And the World Food Program has already reported that 9 out of 10 Gazans cannot eat every day. Many people in Gaza are now eating grass or animal feed, which they are also running out of because of Israel's intentional starvation of a civilian population. So, despite the false narrative created by the fake news, the reality is that the apartheid state of Israel is occupying Gaza and committing the war crimes of indiscriminate bombing, collective punishment, and using starvation as a weapon of war. And for those crimes, the government of South Africa has already launched a trial at the International Court of Justice against the Israeli government. And the International Court of Justice has found the claims from the South African government as plausible, so they are engaged in a full trial to prosecute those crimes. And in the meantime, the International Court of Justice ordered the Israeli government to completely stop all war crimes which could amount to genocide under the current Genocide Convention. Unfortunately, the Israeli government has doubled down on committing these genocidal war crimes. What Hamas did on October 7th was wrong, but that does not justify any of Israel's war crimes. That does not justify Israel engaging in a plausible genocide. So there is a fairy tale version of events spread in the American mainstream media, which portrays Israel as the good guys and Palestinians as the bad guys. But the reality is not so simple. There are actually significant changes that need to happen in both populations in order to facilitate a lasting peace. And right now, the main thing that needs to happen is war criminals being held accountable for their war crimes. So you may have heard of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez coming over to the right side of history finally, saying that Israel is engaged in a genocide, and as long as Israel is engaged in that genocide, the United States should completely stop all offensive military weapon supplies and funding for the Israeli government. So AOC is advocating for human rights conditions to actually be enforced on U.S. aid to Israel. And that's something that progressives like myself have been advocating for multiple years, ever since Human Rights Watch encouraged the United States to enforce the Leahy Laws against Israeli funding in 2019. And I have a high degree of certainty that if the United States had just enforced the Leahy Laws, this war could have been prevented altogether. Unfortunately, one of the most powerful lobbying organizations in the entire world is the Israel Lobby, and the power that the Israel Lobby holds over the United States Congress and presidency is unparalleled. So the idea of enforcing human rights conditions on U.S. aid to Israel is almost unheard of in Washington, D.C. And this year, in 2024, the Israel Lobby has already committed to spending over $100 million to oust any member of Congress who supports human rights conditions enforced on American aid to Israel. So, without any doubt, the Israel Lobby is one of the biggest adversaries to American democracy. And if the American people should be concerned about any country's election interference in our elections, it is the election interference from Israel that we should be concerned about. Because the debate right now is between the establishment in America, who supports unconditional aid to Israel with absolutely no red lines, even at a time when the International Court of Justice has found the accusations of genocide to be plausible, versus the progressive left, who have said war crimes are always wrong. Crimes against humanity are always wrong. And even when our allies are committing war crimes or crimes against humanity, America should not be supporting those crimes. And it is absolutely insane that inside of America, it is the progressive left being criticized for maintaining unconditional opposition to war crimes and crimes against humanity. So the false narrative built around this conflict is that there was a ceasefire on October 7th, the Israeli military had completely pulled out of Gaza in 2005, and the Israeli military is intending to only take out Hamas terrorists with minimal impact to civilians. The reality is the exact opposite. There was no ceasefire on October 7th. The apartheid state of Israel had been engaged in over a decade-long illegal blockade of Gaza, and the Israeli military has intentionally targeted civilians not only with bombing, but also with a siege of Gaza, knowingly blocking food, water, medicine, and electricity to civilians, including children. So the question is, where do we go from here? And to me, the solution seems to be that all war criminals, Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli leaders engaged in a plausible genocide, as well as the Hamas terrorists who engaged in terrorist attacks on October 7th, all need to be held accountable for the war crimes that they have committed. In addition, the United States needs to strictly enforce human rights conditions on all aid that we send Israel. The Israeli government has not been a partner for peace in the region, and they have refused to become one as long as they have the unconditional backing of the world's sole superpower. So as long as the United States refuses to enforce human rights conditions on the aid that we send Israel, the United States is also complicit in the ongoing genocide of Gaza. And that does not require any new laws to be passed. It only requires Joe Biden making the choice to enforce what are called Leahy Laws, which prohibit the United States government from funding any foreign military engaged in gross violations of human rights. So, the most obvious solution to ending American complicity in Israel's war crimes is changing our stance from unconditional support for Israel to conditional support for Israel, with the conditions being a complete cessation of Israel's war crimes and crimes against humanity. And for the actual people in the region, there are three options: the ongoing genocide and intentional ethnic cleansing of Gaza so that the apartheid state of Israel can resettle that land, or a two-state solution, or what would probably be best is a single state with equal rights for all. The only way we could truly move forward peacefully is by ushering in a cultural renaissance in the region. Both the Israelis and Palestinians need to develop a mutual respect for human life. Each population is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And both populations need to become a partner for peace so that they could live peacefully side by side. And I don't know if we have ever been further away from a lasting peace than right now. All I know is that significant changes need to be made in order to shift the trajectory of this conflict, because right now, one of the worst humanitarian conflicts in the world is unfolding, and it is completely man-made. So I was very happy to see Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez come over to the right side of history and say genocide is always wrong even when Israel commits it. I hope that the rest of the Democratic Party, especially Joe Biden, follows her lead, because America has been in desperate need of some moral leadership in this conflict, and so far it's only come from the progressive left. I hope the rest of America soon follows. Instead of enforcing the Leahy Laws, Joe Biden issued a strongly worded letter to the Israeli government, asking them to comply with international law. In response to that letter, the Israeli government told the Biden administration that they will continue to do whatever they want without consequence. So then the US State Department came out with a report saying that they have not yet assessed that the Israeli government is in violation of international law. The State Department did not say that Israel is in compliance with international law, just that they have not yet assessed that Israel is in violation of international law. Which is just a very weaselly way to say that knowing that Israel is in violation of international law, they want to continue to fund Israel unconditionally, so they are not yet willing to assess that Israel is in violation of the law. And it is that very act, the State Department's refusal to acknowledge reality, that enables the American government to continue to fund Israel despite knowing that Israel is in violation of international law. So to anybody acknowledging the basic reality of the situation, there is an unfolding genocide going on with the Israeli government committing it against the Gazan population of Palestinians. That genocide is being carried out with the unconditional support of the American government, and the Israeli government is totally dependent on the American government's protection and funding. So this genocide could stop if Joe Biden ordered it to. Not directly, but Joe Biden could enforce human rights conditions on all aid America sends to Israel. Then, since the Israeli government would have no choice but to accept the conditions that Joe Biden chooses to enforce, they would have to stop committing genocide. And at this point, the starvation of children is Joe Biden's legacy. And I have no doubt that Donald Trump would be far worse on this issue than Joe Biden. But the question is not, do I support one genocide candidate versus another genocidal candidate? The question is, do I support any genocidal candidate or withhold my vote? So my red line as a voter is complicity in genocide. Joe Biden has a choice. Does he want to be complicit in genocide and lose my vote? Or does he want to stop being complicit in genocide?